Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I'm Craig Bennett. I'm Chief Executive of Friends of the Earth in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to this conference on Brexit and the environment, what next. I'm told that Molly, our first keynote speaker, is just around the corner, so I'm going to kick off by welcoming you. And I'll say again, if you're tweeting this afternoon, please do use the hashtag environment after Brexit. Now, we originally thought it would be good, but as Friends of the Earth, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, the other organisations participating this afternoon, hosting this afternoon, and my colleagues at Friends of the Earth Europe, we thought it would be good to have this conference today, perhaps just a few days after the UK had left the EU, to reflect on this. I have to say, I'm delighted that as we stand here now, that's not yet happened. We're very pleased that at the moment, at the very least, we're taking longer to work out the future relationship and try and get it right. But it's worth reflecting, isn't it, that if you look at actually the science, say, of climate change, if you look at what scientists were telling us just a few months ago, and just how serious that is, it kind of makes you think how much time we're spending on this issue at the moment. I'm going to read you just a sentence or two from this extraordinary paper that was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Some of the world's leading climate scientists published this just last August ahead of the IPCC 1.5 report called Trajectories of the Earth System in the Anthropocene. And just a couple of sentences that I think really stand out. These are the world's leading climate scientists coming together. We argue that social and technological trends and decisions occurring over the next decade or two could significantly influence the trajectory of the Earth system for tens to hundreds of thousands of years and potentially lead to conditions that resemble planetary states that were last seen several million years ago, conditions that would be inhospitable to current human societies and to many other contemporary species. Decisions occurring in the next decade or so. You do find yourself wondering, given that's what the world's best scientists are warning us, why on earth are we wasting time talking about anything else at the moment? Why on earth are we in Britain fiddling with Brexit while the planet burns? Because that's the reality of what's going on at the moment. And I do think future generations will look back at this time and wonder, what on earth were we doing? Whether you're for Brexit or against it, is it really the biggest priority that we face as society right now? And according to the science, that's absolutely not the case. But let's set a bit of context, because it is almost 3 years on from the referendum in the United Kingdom. And it's worth saying, as Friends of the Earth in 2016, we campaigned passionately for Britain to remain in the EU for good environmental reasons. We took a good hard look at the evidence over the many decades history of the UK being a member of the EU, and we concluded on balance that unquestionably the environment had benefited through Britain's membership of the EU. And it's not hard to see why, is it? The environment is something that knows no boundaries. Boundaries are something that are invented by humans. They do not exist in nature. And therefore it's absolutely obvious that to solve environmental problems, you need cooperation across boundaries. And more to the point, given that we are still in a world where many countries will argue that protecting the environment might harm their competitiveness, that old chestnut, that old phrase we've heard time and time again, actually the prospect of 28 countries moving together to raise standards and improve their environmental standards simultaneously actually is something that's easier to do than perhaps some countries standing out and trying to raise them unilaterally. So there's good reason why, on balance, the EU has enabled 28 member states to raise their environmental standards over the last few decades. Not nearly as fast or as much as they should have done, I would argue, but nonetheless, it's been important for doing that. So we campaigned vigorously during that 2016 referendum. Unfortunately, the result went the other way, but at least the work we did and those of some other environmental groups, I hope, put the environment more on the agenda around Brexit than it would have done otherwise. And perhaps is the reason why both Michael Gove, a prominent campaigner for leave in the referendum, but now our Environment Secretary in the UK, and Theresa May, who's someone you might have heard of as well, have both promised over the last year to maintain and enhance environmental protections as we Brexit. But I have to tell you that as of today, on a day that is actually after the day when we should have left the EU, according to Theresa May's timetable, the simple fact is, and it applies as a fact whether as a British person you voted leave or remain, that promise to maintain and enhance our environmental protections as we Brexit, if we left today, would be broken. It would have been broken if we'd left just last week or a couple of weeks ago on March the 29th. It would be broken if we leave this Friday. It would be broken if we left on May the 12th, May the 22nd, or June the 30th, whatever these dates that are currently being thrown around are discussed. Because the simple fact is in the UK, we have not yet put the measures in place to even maintain our environmental protections as we Brexit, let alone the second half of that promise, enhance. We've had lots of lovely promises from the UK government about things they're going to do, but those mechanisms are not in place yet. Some of you might be familiar with the withdrawal bill that went through the House of Commons last year. This was essentially an attempt by the UK government to cut and paste EU legislation into UK law on the thinking that, well, we can sort it out later. But all of us know from spending too much time staring at our own laptops, that when you cut and paste, often things go wrong. Often things go wrong with the formatting. You lose the references, you lose the fonts change, all those kind of things, and key aspects of it are lost. And that's exactly what's happened on a lot of the environmental measures with the withdrawal bill that went through Parliament last year. References to EU schedules, particularly in the Habitats Directive, have been lost, and it's still very unclear exactly what's going to happen on them. Most importantly, perhaps, key legal principles like the precautionary principle have not yet been put into UK law, and we're going to hear more about that, I'm sure, this afternoon. And also, Britain has only perhaps at best even begun thinking about the kind of institutions that we would need to replace the EU institutions that currently do such an important job on enforcement of EU environmental legislation. Take, for example, our current membership of the EU Chemicals Agency. The UK government is currently hoping to replace that with just putting more duties, requirements on our Health and Safety Executive, with nothing like the same level of resources that would go into scrutinising chemicals that are currently done by the EU Chemicals Agency. I could go on and on and on. It really is just a factual assessment. It doesn't matter where you are, if you're British on this whole debate of leave and remain, we're not ready, and if we were to leave right now, or even on June the 30th, that would leave Theresa May's promise of maintaining and enhancing environmental protections as we Brexit would end up being a broken promise. But it's not just that causes us concern as Friends of the Earth still about Brexit and the environment. Because in addition to everything I've just said, trade trumps everything. And I use those words advisedly. Because the fact is it's looking perhaps more likely now that perhaps where we will end up is perhaps, we can all speculate, can't we? I'm sure we'll spend a long time doing it, but perhaps in some form of customs union, which means that the UK will need to work very closely with the EU on issues to do with trade. And so it's worth saying a few things about that, isn't it? Because historically over the years, both for the EU and certainly the way a lot of the Brexiteers are talking at the moment in London about trade and new trade deals, that is being used as a perfect excuse to deregulate. In fact, you could argue, of course, that Brexit was fundamentally a deregulatory project because the vast majority of politicians that campaigned for it did so on the promise that it would enable us to cut, quote unquote, all this EU red tape. What they really meant by that in many cases was health, safety and labour regulations. And so this is a great concern to us, whether the EU is whether the UK is trying to forge its own trade deals in the future, and I think it's going to have real challenges doing that, or indeed if it ends up doing them jointly through some kind of customs union. And really the same applies with what I'm about to say next in either case, whether it's to the UK for trying to forge new trade deals, or indeed the EU with the UK as part of that somehow. In this day and age, with what I've just read to you about climate change and just the fierce urgency of now tackling this, we cannot allow any trade deal that will make that situation worse. We absolutely cannot have a global trading system that results in a lowering of standards. We should have one that results in a raising of standards. And I'm struck by the memory that when Donald Trump got elected, you remember, I think his first press conference was on the golden escalator at the bottom of Trump Tower. Something like that. Do you remember that? That weird photo opportunity? Very strange. Well, the way to look at it is if we're ever going to have trade deals, then they should be on some kind of golden escalator, where we're always looking to raise those social and environmental and health standards. In fact, let's be more specific about this. How could the UK or the EU justify doing a trade deal with any country that is not part of the Paris Agreement? So one of the things I want to make very, very clear today is that Friends of the Earth will campaign vigorously against a trade deal between the UK and the United States for as long as the US remains absent from the Paris Agreement. And that's worth something, because actually, as Friends of the Earth, we have been pretty successful with others in stopping certain trade deals in the past. But I also want to say a few other key things which are important. We need to make sure, whatever happens next on the UK and the EU's future relationship, not just in trade, but also in our bilateral arrangements, that we need that golden escalator of standards and action as we move forwards. Rather than having ceilings around our standards and our action and our regulations, let's be bold and let's push them as high as we can. We also need that radically reformed trade policy so that trade become a force for good rather than a force for harm. And I will draw your attention to this excellent report published by Friends of the Earth Europe just last year. You'll probably hear more from it this afternoon. Setting a course for sustainable trade, setting out a new trade agenda that serves people in the environment, with some excellent principles in there about how to make sure trade can be sustainable. And we need to increase that ambition to cut emissions and fight climate change. It's telling that right now very few EU member states are doing anything like the action required to even come close to matching the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. And I think it's worth saying that if you were to ask EU consumers, do they want to feel that when there are trade deals put in place, it makes them easier to buy products that have been produced in a way that harm people in the environment? I think you'd get a resounding no from EU consumers. So I think these are all issues that are very important for us to explore right now, in this time when things are still very uncertain about the UK and the EU's future relationship. But it's time for us in this community, in the sustainability community, for us to perhaps issue our own red lines, or perhaps we can say green lines, about the things that absolutely cannot be allowed to get worse, and the things that might put us backwards in any future UK-EU relationship, or indeed in trade relationships between the EU and the UK and the rest of the world. And the final point I wanted to say, in 2016, when Friends of the Earth took the decision to campaign vigorously for Remain in the referendum in the UK, we did so based absolutely on evidence, on the evidence of what would be the right thing for the environment. It's worth saying that even after 2 years of the Article 50 clock having run out, 2.5 years, almost 3 years after the referendum, and lots of promises from the UK government, actually the facts haven't changed. As of today, the best thing for the environment would still be for the UK to remain part of the EU. And if, where we find ourselves going here, there might be a second referendum in the UK, Friends of the Earth would campaign vigorously to remain. Thank you very much. So I now want to introduce and welcome up here Molly Scat-Cato, who I'm sure many of you know very well, and as our keynote speaker. Do you want to come up here, Molly?
Very much.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Craig. Nice
Hello.
to see you.
Very nice to see you, Molly. I was wondering if you'd get here on top, but you did.
Yeah, I think it was okay. Right, who's going to be my glamorous assistant then? Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. So, I'm going to cover some of the same turf that Craig's laid out there, but from a very European perspective. And the first slide just tells you what I'm going to be going through. So, essentially, what are we losing if we go ahead and leave the EU? Incidentally, I'm wearing my Shakespeare for Europe badge here, and I've got my Stop Brexit badge on my coat, so I'm absolutely not accepting that we're leaving. And I'm sorry if we're giving you a rough ride, but Brexit isn't just a disaster for Britain, it's also a serious attack on the European Union, so I hope you will support us in our efforts to stay. And I'm at the moment organising myself to campaign in the European elections, so we're still here, and in my view, we're staying. So this is what I'm going to cover. What are we losing if we do go ahead and leave the EU, and what replaces it in terms of British domestic law? What are the political pressures that lie behind Brexit? And lastly, who is really behind it in terms of power, and what are they hoping to achieve? So, firstly, as Craig said, during the referendum, we as the Green Party, I'm a Green Party MEP, and we focused a lot on the environmental benefits of being in the EU. We fought a totally positive campaign, and we just talked about the benefits, and so as Greens we felt that our major role was to talk about the environmental benefits. And there's no question that the UK has benefited hugely in terms of the environmental law that's come from the EU, and 80% of all environmental law in the UK is actually EU law. So you can see there this has provided very significant protection for wildlife sites, and also, as Craig said, we know that a lot of the people on the Leave side, part of their reason for supporting Brexit was deliberately to try and trash these laws that protect our environment, and they were actually quite open about that. And we're going to come to them a little bit later on in the presentation. So what other kinds of things might we be losing? Well, as you very well know, the EU has banned neonicotinoid pesticides that are very damaging to bees. The UK tried to stop that ban and has also given exemptions, which I think are really quite questionable in many cases. We have also got so far as nearly achieving a ban on glyphosate, and again, that's something that has received considerable resistance in the UK. I myself was part of the negotiating team when we limited the use of antibiotics on farms. This hasn't received that much attention in the media actually, but effectively what we're saying is you can't routinely dose animals with antibiotics because it is part of what gives rise to antibiotic resistance. If you can't do that on farms, then effectively that means you can't have the overstocking and the industrial level densities that we currently see on our farms, so it's very important in terms of animal welfare as well as public health. It's highly likely that if we left the EU, there'd be pressure to oppose that kind of restriction because, again, the UK lobbied against it when we were negotiating it. Craig also mentioned the Chemicals Directive and the REACH Directive and the control on certain chemicals, and then these very important legal principles that we rely on all the time as green politicians here in Europe, the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle, haven't been translated into UK law. So that, as a green and somebody who wants this protection for the environment, this legal protection, leaves me feeling pretty nervous. On the other hand, when you look at what Barnier and his team required the British government to sign up to, there is some protection there in the Withdrawal Agreement. So there is this idea of the level playing field, which means we won't allow you to outcompete us by trashing your environment and your tax regime and all sorts of other things. And in fact, this is kind of more stringent requirements in terms of the preparation for a trade deal than the EU's ever used with other partners. And I think that's completely right, because the UK is here right at the heart of the EU. And if we decided to deregulate, if that's on environmental law or on tax policy, it would really damage the EU and it would make it very difficult to maintain EU standards. So I'm pleased. I've met some of the guys that did this negotiation, and I think they fought quite hard to stop the sort of reduction in standards that the Brexiteers were threatening. And the UK has committed to maintain an equivalent level of environmental protection provided by common standards. Of course, the weakness of this is that it's pretty difficult to define what that equivalence would actually be in reality, so we can foresee quite a few legal tussles here. But at least the part of the Brexit deal, which is legally enforceable, the Withdrawal Agreement, does include some pretty significant environmental protections. And then I just wanted to say a little bit about sustainable finance. I'm holding the A there on again, by the way, just in case you wondered. I wanted to say a little bit about sustainable finance because this has taken up quite a lot of my time in the past year. As a green economist, I was sort of quite lucky to come into the Parliament and help to actually drive this agenda because it's perfect for somebody with my skills, really. But we've already got 2 bits of law that we've negotiated that will come into force in 2 years' time. One on disclosures, which is the first mandatory disclosure regime anywhere in the world, and that says that you have a right to know what's being done with your money. I mean, it's pretty astonishing that actually took quite a battle to achieve that. But about 50% of people's money invested in pension funds and savings and investments could have been, cutting down rainforest and putting palm oil plantations, and you simply didn't have the right to know. But now you do have the right to know. So to me, that's a significant bit of law. And one of the things that was quite sad when we were negotiating this was that the EU set up various technical expert groups, and they didn't include any Brits. And considering how we like to think that we're leading on finance, and sometimes on the environment too, to not be part of those high-level groups on sustainable finance, I think is a terrible loss to us, whether we go ahead with Brexit or not. So that was important. Then we had the benchmarking, which is effectively guiding investors who want to prioritise environmental benefit towards certain kinds of funds because they have a sustainability mark. And if we've got that right, once we launch those benchmarks, we will see considerable money, not just European money, but also the Japanese Public Pension Fund are looking for this kind of benchmark. So hopefully large amounts of money flooding in to fund our sustainability transition here in Europe. The third piece of this, there's about 10 pieces of legislation coming. We've got 2 properly negotiated into law. The third one is a little bit behind, but we have voted this now in the Parliament, and that's the taxonomy regulation, and that's about how we define what actually is a sustainable investment. And although we didn't get everything we wanted in terms of the negotiation inside the Parliament did vote to exclude fossil fuels and nuclear from anything labelled sustainable. I mean, I know that's obvious to us, but again, the fossil fuel lobby came in quite hard here, and it was quite difficult to sustain that position. I think we kept nuclear out by 2 votes out of 751, actually, so that tells you what we're up against some of the time. Anyway, that will be negotiated in the next Parliament with the Council, and will hopefully then help to guide this shift of finance away from destructive investments and towards sustainable investments. And yeah, also I like to say when I'm talking about sustainable finance that this is just about signalling to the private sector and guiding the private sector investment, but it's really important that we find public sector money as well to fund this sustainability transition, and that's partly through what we call the Green New Deal, and we need to focus on the Green New Deal in Europe as well as in the UK, and that's something we could do outside the European Union, but how much more powerful it would be if we engaged in that and embarked on that exciting project together. Okay, so a little bit about trade. Straight after the Brexit vote, obviously after sort of mending my broken heart and shedding a lot of tears, I tried to think about ways in which Brexit might actually be of benefit to the sort of politics I'm interested in. And I started thinking about trade, because obviously the EU's trade policy is not the most sustainable aspect of what we all do here. And so I commissioned a couple of people to think about this, and they suggested that there were 4 ways the UK could go in terms of its future trade policy. The one they called dumped with Trump, effectively undercutting, following the US down that path of risky approaches to environmental policy, factory farming and so on. We would need to do that if we were in a trade agreement with the US, because then we would get into that situation of undercutting, and for our farmers, for example, to compete, they would need to cut the very high animal welfare standards they have at the moment. So this is a pretty dire scenario, but one that's favoured by Liam Fox. In fact, he has written a trade policy kind of behind closed doors in a totally undemocratic way, together with the Cato Institute, the right-wing institute in the US. So we know that this is where the hard Brexiteers are focused. Then we have this idea of the Empire Strikes Back, which is this completely crazy thought that we'll somehow, get these really preferential trade deals with the Commonwealth because they still love the mother country so much. Anyway, I'm sorry, I can't really engage much time in this because it's an absurd fantasy. But just to say, notice that New Zealand is actually engaged in very intensive agriculture, although they're hoping to shift that now. They've seen, once they remove subsidies from their farmers, they saw significant environmental declines in standards and very significant impacts on the environment there. So even that doesn't protect environmental standards. Footloose and fancy free, that's the sort of, don't worry, we'll go out there on WTO rules, and that'll make us completely free, as if we were sort of pirates on the high seas. I think that's how they conceive of it. But of course, it's just moving into a situation where you have to negotiate with 164 other member states rather than just 27, which we've obviously struggled with as the UK. And some of those states are places like Argentina that aren't exactly like, biggest number one fans of the UK. So if we do go down that route, and I pray to God we don't, we're going to really face significant difficulties. And of course, the green option was this idea of much greater self-reliance, reduced trade, reduced food miles, and so on, which I see as a potential possible future, apart from the fact that I don't have the power to make that happen. I've got far too much. How much time have I got left now? I'm waffling on too much, aren't I? 5 minutes left, do you reckon?
A little bit left.
Oh, God. Okay. Let's just show the slide that's got the farmers on it then. I won't say much about farming except to say we all know that the CAP is probably the most unsustainable thing that happens in the European Union. I sit on the Agriculture Committee. We as Greens have about 25% of the support in that committee, and 75% is with agribusiness and the big farming lobby, and that is why we have very destructive farming policies. But when we come to skip the slide of Michael Gove being attacked by a plant, and we'll go on to skip the next slide as well. You can look up that stuff. That's ploughing a lone furrow. That's work I did about how we could rethink our farming strategy outside the EU. But yes, you've missed Michael Gove being attacked by a plant, which is probably just as well. But just to say that the agriculture bill that Michael Gove produced, in spite of all his warm words about how he was going to produce a much more environmentally sensitive approach to farming support, the reality was that it's all vague language. There's nothing legally binding about it at all. So we're going to leave the common agricultural policy and move into a future where we simply don't know what farmers will be paid to do. We've heard a lot of great stuff about how it'll be public money for public goods, carbon-rich farming and farms that protect us against flooding and all these kinds of things, but nothing is tied down in law. And that's why my colleague Caroline Lucas wrote in the HuffPost about what an incredibly vulnerable position that leaves us in as environmentalists as well as farmers. And the arguments we made about having an environmental protection watchdog have actually been reduced to a watchdog that just sits inside DEFRA and so is not independent at all. Just a little bit, because it's election season, so you'll forgive me if I talk a little bit about what the Green Party called for. Obviously, we call for precautionary principle and polluter pays principle to be enshrined in British law, and also the recognition of animal sentience. And then we were very clear that we needed to have this independent court casting judgment on an Environmental Protection Act. And that's absolutely crucial. If you think about air quality, we had Client Earth taking cases to the European Court of Justice. We must have a court to replace that is independent of politics in the UK. Okay, now just my last little bit of time I'll spend terrifying you about what's really going on with Brexit. Please check out two websites. One's called The Bad Boys of Brexit and the other one is called The Brexit Syndicate. But this building is kind of at the heart of the whole Brexit conspiracy. It's just round the corner from Europe House in London, where I have an office, 55 Tufton Street. It was a sort of nest of all these people who wanted to burn all the red tape and cut tax, undermine tax policy, and also the Brexit campaigners. So you can see a list of the kind of people and organisations who were inside that building. And effectively, I see Brexit as a sort of operation, really, to undermine the sort of world that we've all been successfully building here in Europe, with higher standards on consumer rights and on workers' rights and on environmental protections and on tax policy and financial control. And these are the citizens of nowhere that don't want to have anything to do with that. And they see Britain as the weak point in terms of undermining that kind of regulation. And the Brexit Syndicate website explains very clearly who those people are. They have fake think tanks, they have newspapers, they have a whole sort of nexus of organisations which is being driven through our politics by the European Research Group, so-called European Research Group, in the House of Commons. So this is a deeply political matter. It's of deep concern to all environmentalists, but also to all Europeans, because Britain is just the first point where this will be picked off, and they are certainly coming for other countries next. Just to go back to this question of the global perspective, I think it's absolutely true what Craig was saying about using the Paris Agreement as a clear sign of who we should work with in the world. And we've been very clear, and we've had quite a few MEPs now sign this letter saying we will not sign off on the Mercosur Agreement, which is the trading bloc that includes Brazil. And it will be 4 times as large as the JEFTA Agreement, incidentally. It's a really huge trade agreement that's in the pipeline now. We will not sign off on that unless Bolsonaro is committed to staying in the Paris Agreement and demonstrates that he's serious about that. Because otherwise what we're looking at is a situation where we end up importing products from a trashed Amazon, and that simply cannot be allowed to happen. So if this mantra that Malmström uses when she talks about trade for all, means anything at all, then it must mean that we cannot sign a trade deal with somebody like Bolsonaro and his appalling standards on the environment, but also on social and civil rights. So I'm going to do one political slide to finish up with, just to say politics does matter. This is Isabella Lövins, who is Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden before their elections, and this is her photo in response to that appalling photo you might have seen of Trump signing the declaration to say they were coming out of the Paris Agreement. Obviously, I like this picture because it's all women, but I also like it because it's a bunch of green politicians actually making a difference. So don't underestimate the power we can have through using politics. People have lost faith in politics, but we shouldn't. It's very powerful. There are people that are operating outside the political sphere, undermining democracy and using authoritarian regimes to trash the kind of world we've been fighting for. But we still have the power to change the world through politics, so please don't give up on that. Thank you very much.
Molly, thank you very much. Okay, I think we've got time for just perhaps a couple of quick questions to Molly. Anyone? Anyone burning to ask a question?
You can argue with me, it's fine.
Or you can argue, make a comment. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, gentleman there.
I'm David Lawrence from the Trade Justice Movement. Just on the Withdrawal Agreement, you seem to like the level playing field provisions which do protect some form of non-aggression on environmental principles. So it's clear that that's legally enforceable, but do you think it's actually practically enforceable? Like, could you see the EU actually bringing a challenge if the UK deviated slightly on an environmental thing? Because I'm not too clear what the dispute resolution procedure there is, but it seems like it would be a lot harder than, say, currently under the European Court's jurisdiction.
I think that's something that will have to be addressed in the next phase of the negotiations, and there'll be various dispute resolution settlement mechanisms that will have to be resolved. And also because, I mean, you can see that at the moment the WTO dispute resolution mechanism is effectively breaking down and being sabotaged by Trump, so that doesn't look like a suitable mechanism. But what I would say about whether this is enforceable is it's down to you, okay? It's down to you to make sure that you take those cases, that you make it enforceable. The legal guys and Barnier's team have put that stuff in there so you can challenge us as the UK if we seek to reduce standards. But that's there as a legal protection, but people have to exercise that legal protection. And so just as Client Earth took the British government to court here in Luxembourg over not meeting air quality standards, similarly, if the UK starts undercutting, if Brexit happens and if we go ahead with it, then people have to use that law. But I think it will need to be, I agree with you, we'll need to have more clarity on how that will actually, where that will be tested in the next phase of the negotiations.
And just to check that, it's definitely possible, right? It's not just a state-to-state dispute. Any organisation could use the Withdrawal Agreement to challenge.
Well, I think it would be a question of, I'm not sure that we're clear about that yet. I think that will take, how that will work will be detailed in the actual trade relationship that follows. And that's also a worry because obviously the political declaration is entirely just warm words at the moment, none of it legally actionable. So that is a very good question to ask, and we need to ask those sorts of questions the whole time that the political declaration is turning into a proper trade negotiation. And then we in the Parliament, well, I hope I'm here, Sirpa, hopefully we'll be there.
I hope you are.
Have to also make sure we keep our eye on that. And you have to remind us to watch that when we've got 1,000 other things going on.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Hello? Yeah.
One, so Elaine Gilligan from Friends of the Earth. So in the British media today, Molly, there's stories running about the fact that opinion polling showing that people want more authoritarian politics because they're so fed up of what's going on in the UK. There's also talk about fielding more right-wing candidates in the MEP's elections. In fact, Jacob Rees-Mogg is obviously being condemned rightly for encouraging bad behaviour. So I think we've got a massive toxic issue now in the UK. What's your sense in terms of how the Green Party are going to handle the MEP elections in the UK?
This isn't just a UK issue. As I see it, this rise of authoritarianism is a consequence of our having been successful in constraining the forces of capital. And people that just want to make a profit and trash our rights and trash our environment are fighting back. and they're fighting back by undermining democracy. And they're using Facebook, and they're using social media and these fake think tanks and all sorts of reproduction and creation of echo chambers in a completely undemocratic way to undermine the democratic standards that we've expected. And I've done quite a lot of work on that, which you can find on my website. There's a whole lot of stuff on populism and fascism and how they work and how we can all resist. And again, as citizens, it's our duty to do that. On Jacob Rees-Mogg, I'm actually his MEP. So I responded to his his tweet said, don't let us stay in the EU, because if you do, we're going to be so difficult and troublesome, and we'll, vote against the budget and make your lives impossible. So I just responded saying, I'm your MEP, and I actually am terribly cooperative, and people would really hate it if you'd really hate it if I got re-elected, so people can all vote for me and piss off Jacob Rees-Mogg, basically. So I'm using that to my electoral advantage. But I must say, it's going to be an interesting election. I think it will be like a proxy referendum. Maybe we'll get the real referendum as well later. I certainly hope so. But certainly the pro-European groups, and we have the most powerful pro-European movement anywhere in the continent now, and they are gearing up now to make this a celebration of European values. And that's what we'll be doing. And on the other side, we'll have people saying, I'm more angry than I was last year, and no positive proposal. And I think we can win that one. And I think we should be positive and confident about winning it. We will see bad standards of behaviour. We will see intimidation. We will see threats of violence. And we have to do our best to ensure that the people who protect the political space, whether that's in individual debates or in media debates, resist that rather than encouraging it, which unfortunately we've seen so far. But I think this is a global battle we're in here to protect democracy. And there's two very good sources I would suggest. One is Umberto Eco's 14 Signs of Fascism, based on Italian fascism, which is available on my website. If you just put Molly Scott Cato fascism into Google, you get there. I'm not suggesting you think there's a connection there, but and the other one is the book On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder, which again is 20 short chapters and very positive proposals about what you can do. So it's a really important question. We've been the object of this authoritarian attack, as I see it, and we're sort of working out how it works and how to respond. But it's certainly a global movement. So if it hasn't happened in your country yet, it's coming your way. So please wise up and fight for democracy.
Okay, well, I'd like to ask you all to give Molly a big thank you for those comments today. Molly, thank you very much. And now let's have our first panel. I'd like to invite our first three panellists up, Charlotte, David and Serpa. Thank you. Good, thank you very much. Well, one of the biggest areas of sort of debate, perhaps around any sort of future relationship between the UK and the EU, if Brexit happens, will be around the possibility or not for dynamic alignment on regulation. In other words, do regulations and standards in the UK keep aligned with EU regulations and standards as they change, or might they diverge over time? That's my very simple summary, Christmas cracker version of it, if you like. So we have three excellent speakers to join us this afternoon to help make sense of that. Professor Charlotte Burns, research leader, Brexit Environment Grouping, which is also one of the co-organisers here this afternoon. David Baldock, Director of Institute for European Environmental Policy, and Serpa, and sorry Serpa, I don't know quite how to pronounce your surname, so you have to tell me, I'm afraid. Yes, exactly. So one of the things that in Britain we're certainly personally I'm not so good at is always managing to get that right. So, but member of the Environment Committee. So we're very grateful for you all joining us this afternoon. I'm going to invite each panelist to just comment for sort of 5-10 minutes on some headline thoughts about this, and give their views on the issue, and then we can open it up for debate and Q&A. So I invite Charlotte to kick us off.
All right, thank you very much, Craig, and thank you for having me here today. When we first started talking about this event, as Craig said at the outset, we had anticipated there would be a bit more certainty about the Brexit process and wanted to be looking forward. So I have prepared my presentation with that more forward-looking perspective. And to take it back to, it's quite nice to be in Brussels because the UK feels very parochial and inward-looking at the moment, and all the discussions around Brexit. And there's a belated realisation dawning in the UK, I think, that actually this is just stage 1 of Brexit if we actually go through it. And the next stage is going to be the really tricky bit, which is negotiating some kind of association agreement or trade agreement. And there are critical questions that we still need to address. And I'm really grateful that Craig defined dynamic alignment there, because that's one of the critical questions. There's lots of discussion of dynamic alignment in the UK at the moment, with Labour and Conservative Party in these discussions, with Labour pushing for some kind of model of dynamic alignment. But there's this question mark over what does that mean in practice? How will it be policed? Who will be policing it? The UK, particularly Michael Gove, has been making commitments to rivalrous emulation, which is a phrase I really like, being an academic. But we're uncertain as to what that means as well. I assume it means there'll be some kind of race to the top between the EU and the UK. So it's good to hear that rhetorically, but what will that mean in practice? What will it look like? Will it be Craig's golden or green escalator? So in terms of those challenges, if we're thinking about environment, one of the things we need to do as part of the conversation about dynamic alignment is ensure that environmental standards are part of the debate. At the moment in the UK, they tend to be tacked on a bit at the end after workers' protection. So they need to be a central part of that debate. And the definition of what counts as an environmental standard, in my view, needs to be as inclusive as possible. So when we're talking about the level playing field, we need to be including in there something more than industrial emissions. We need to be thinking about the environmental acquis as a whole. It's required by the political declaration that we have adequate mechanisms to secure domestic implementation and enforcement in the UK. And we have the new Office for Environmental Protection that's being debated at the moment. And that, as it stands, is not going to provide an equivalent to what we have in the European Commission and the Court of Justice of the European Union, but goes some way towards addressing that. However, there's a key problem. It only covers England. So we have 4 nations in the UK, and only one of those is going to be covered by the Office for Environmental Protection. And Wales and Scotland have consultations ongoing at the moment. So a key issue we need to think about is how are we going to negotiate with Scotland, Wales, and crucially Northern Ireland? What kind of systems of governance are they going to be putting in place, and how will policies be enforced? And then thinking ahead, in terms of what next, it's not just what next for the UK, it's what next for the EU, particularly in terms of environmental ambition. We're about to have European elections, and the outcome of those elections will be central in terms of shaping the European Parliament. And there's been a lot of coverage about the potential rise of the far right, which tends to be an enviro-sceptic right as well. So that's a key risk. We don't know who the next Commission President is going to be, and we can see from the last Commission, Juncker's Commission, the environment has not been a major priority for that Commission. So there's a key question mark there about how do we ensure that the environment is a major priority for the next Commission. We don't know who the next UK Prime Minister is going to be. We think there'll be a new one within the year. But that, again, will shape the tone of those negotiations. What happens in the European Parliament elections, what kind of new Commission President we get, and what kind of UK Prime Minister we get. And then finally, I was just going to end on the relationship between the EU and the UK at international meetings. I think if we do come out of the EU, and I recognise this is all still up in the air, that could potentially be a really fruitful relationship, assuming that the UK doesn't fritter away any remaining goodwill that we have here in Brussels, because the EU tends to struggle at international negotiations because of having to negotiate amongst the states on the ground. So if the UK and the EU can negotiate a position effectively with each other, that could work incredibly well. So I suppose I'm looking ahead and saying there are lots of risks, there are challenges, but actually there's scope for some fruitful partnership in the future as well. And I'm going to stop there. Am I about 7 minutes?
Charlotte, thank you very much. So let's also now hear from Serpa about your perspectives on dynamic alignment. It'd be very interesting. Obviously, quite a lot of speakers this afternoon, not surprisingly, are sort of British. I think hearing from your perspective on this will be really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, not only for inviting me here, but organizing this event, because I think what Molly said and what this is all about is very crucial, that the environment actually hasn't been talked about at all during the Brexit process, and we have not sort of figured out what might be the consequences or how to preserve the high level and even higher the standards on the environmental side. And there I would like to start with 4 points. The first one is that it is a question about the whole acquis as mentioned, so about the environmental standards that goes not only the emissions, but it goes with the biodiversity, it goes with the climate regulation and all that. But that actually is not adequate. More and more environmental issues and sustainability issues are solved in other pieces of legislation, as you know. What about the impact assessment of a legislation in general when it comes to the cost of non-action? What it comes to developing joint indicators about what is the impact on environment of agriculture or traffic or whatever that is? What about having the climate and sustainability targets in energy production and in traffic? What about the regulation for new cars? What about, as Molly mentioned, the common agricultural policy and what is the possibility for agriculture as act a role of a preserver and act against the climate change, or then the adversary, what role it plays quite a lot at the moment. What about the huge sustainability finance package we've been fighting here in the European Parliament, and this is only initial part, knowing that the London is one of the major financial hubs. Is it going to be the financial regulation where the sustainability and these indicators are going to be incorporated? Is it going to be the new solvencies, new Basels, new whatever the financial regulations where the environmental sustainability are going to be put in? And as mentioned, what about the trade agreements and what kind of a prerequisites for sustainability are we going to have there? What about the next part of the circular economy package? Not only the waste part, but eco-design directives, what kind of a products you can import in EU or in the future in the Brexit area. What about the principle about designing out of the waste? And so on and so on. And actually then it would be important to see that the environment or the sustainability is much broader concept than just the environmental regulation. And then when there would be, I hope so, I hope that there wouldn't be this unhappy divorce, but in case there would be the Brexit, there would be this dynamic alignment, there would be this kind of a constructive agreement. Then it would need to entail all these elements. It would need to entail precautionary principle, it would need to entail the aspiration to raise the standards and seek new avenues. And it would need to entail the promise to act together in international fora to forward these principles in international agreements also. And then my last point, because I think that I'm pretty close about this 5 minutes, is how do we make it legal? A bit like these customs unions would be. It's always nice to have a trust for politics. And let's assume after the next election and this kind of a backdoor alignment or agreement, there would be a huge support from Great Britain for this. What about after next elections? What about if Britons are going to change their mind? Is it just a one-sided possibility to pull away from these commitments, or is it a legally binding document which you can take to a court and which you need to negotiate yourself out, a bit like you needed to negotiate yourself out of the EU? And that is one of the prerequisites. And how can we work together? Because I do see two phenomena that are to be feared for. One is that you can't push it into Great Britain. What do we do with different parties that the Britons will want to have this? What will we do that all partners in the EU want to have it? Because not all of our politicians are eager about doubling the ambition level on 2030 climate targets, or having circular economy or ambitious sustainable finance, or that matter. And if we wouldn't have that, there's high risk about this kind of a contamination, that then if there would be, in quotes, perceived unfair competition from the Great Britain, be it financial, agricultural or whatever markets, what are those populists and those right-wing people going to say in the EU? Look, we are losing. Look, actually they gained these kind of freedoms. We need to do the same in Hungary, in Poland, in Italy, and you name it. And so this can be a multiplier of destructive events if we are not very careful. And then the big question I do not have the answer is, how do we deal with this issue that might actually be much bigger than just the free trade or the debated customs issues or some other, how you get people and goods over the across the borders. Thank you.
Very fascinating. You certainly raised a whole bunch of issues there that I myself hadn't sort of necessarily thought quite so deeply about. So I think very, very useful to have that contribution. Thank you. And so finally now on to David Baldock, who's followed these issues really since the 1980s around EU environment policy. Don't worry, David, you don't have to act like that. We're certainly in the Greener UK coalition, which I've been on the board of over the last 2-3 years, a group of organisations in the UK working around Brexit environment issues. We've really appreciated David's contributions to that. So, David, look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thanks a lot. I'm no longer the director of IEP. I was, but Serpa is the president, so I'm looking at her with due respect. A couple of thoughts about cooperation and a couple of thoughts about dynamic alignment. First, in cooperation, this is a really, really big agenda, and I don't see even the beginnings of it starting to appear over the horizon yet, because not only as everything you said, which I think was extremely helpful, but I see the future of European environmental policy a lot to do with the circular economy, low carbon economy, supply chains, getting consumers to change their habits. We need sustainable consumption. That means verification. It means having transparent supply chains. It means having institutions which are trusted, which are capable of setting parameters. We're talking about what is a different world in which the webs of connection, the webs of market and regulation are going to be much tighter. Having a separate entity in the UK, semi-detached from this world, it is inherently difficult, you know. And I think the distinctions, therefore, between the sort of environmental problems and the economic problems with it are there, but they shouldn't get in the way. It's both at the same time. And the same point applies to leverage on third countries. As we've heard before from Molly and others, the EU is trying to exert influence, for example, on Australians with a trade deal on Paris. The idea of the UK having separate leverage on its own is not very convincing, whereas the need for cooperation is clearly there. Looking at it from the other point of view, I've spent quite a lot of my life working on the evidence base for new EU legislation on the environment, and a lot of that evidence base, oddly enough, comes from the UK because we have a very advanced set of data, the biggest environmental institutions in Europe, large industry of academics publishing material. So even the sort of database which is being used underpinning what goes on in different parts of Europe. It is unhelpful to separate that out. And it's unhelpful if the UK is not in the EEA. So in terms of looking ahead, I think if the UK is going to leave, the cooperation agenda needs to be expanded, recognised for what it is, and that might mean much more substantial chapters in whatever the successor to the political declaration is, building up steps where we see this as one of the tracks where we don't yet know exactly what the tracks of the post-Brexit negotiations will be. This certainly should be a major track, not a minor track. As Sepp has pointed out very eloquently, defining the scope for environment is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, because the whole point is that it's integrated into other sectors, spills and flows into a whole series of different policy departments. Okay, dynamic alignment specifically. Difficult to talk about this very clearly, because essentially, as Craig said, what we mean at the moment, a withdrawal agreement, it talks about non-regression. So in other words, the UK should not go backwards either in law or in the implementation of law. And this is a world first if this is agreed. So let's look at the positive side. We haven't had a trade agreement with such provisions in it before. Whether it's enforceable or not in practical terms is a very big question, but it's still a world first. Now, it's got a sort of mini dynamic alignment for selected measures in the middle of it, which involves a few very sensitive directives, which are not that clearly defined, but it includes the Industrial Emissions Directive, for example, which will be dealt with through a special mechanism, including the Joint Committee, which is one of the mechanisms which will be set up by the withdrawal agreement between the UK and the EU. So that's the kernel of a dynamic alignment machinery if we go down this route. Now, dynamic alignment would raise a lot of questions about what is the scope for it, how far would it go, would it stay with trade-sensitive measures, what are trade-sensitive measures, are they product standards, are they measures which are in the EEA agreement, are they all environment measures as Serpa says, are they pretty much half of the EU's acquis because environment spills into a lot of other measures. Presumably they're not agricultural fisheries because that would be a different step. Will the Commission push dynamic alignment? Well, I think that will depend a lot on what kind of agreement it is. If it's a single market type agreement, I think they will. I don't think on the EU side they will put up with anything less than the backstop environmental arrangements. But if it's just the customs union, I think there will be some nervousness about whether dynamic alignment is proportionate. If, on the other hand, we're talking about something which is more of a single market type relationship, then dynamic alignment becomes very important, very relevant, and the questions about how it would actually work. And on the EU side, I'll stop in a minute. Yeah. So on the EU side, there has to be some clarity here, and there will be nervousness. There already is nervousness in the Commission about the UK cherry picking. So, in other words, wanting to have a single market deal which is selective in terms of the scope and the measures it covers, and then possibly putting on the table bits of dynamic alignment which appear to be in its own interest. I think there's even a danger, actually, the Commission could be oversensitive to cherry picking and exclude things which would be helpful for Europe as a whole. On the other hand, if we look at dynamic alignment in a more ambitious way, then the question is, what does this entail for the UK? Is the UK going to voluntarily follow dynamic alignment? Will Parliament get to vote? Will it be the vassal state, as Boris Johnson often says? In other words, will be photocopying exercise in the UK. Is that really democratically realistic? Is there a way in which there could be proper parliamentary engagement? Is there a forum where we could see the UK and the EU working together, which wasn't a horribly messy Swiss-style multi-agreement type of model, which understandably a lot of people are very concerned to avoid? Could it be a slightly more integrated type of model? Is there a value to the UK having inputs into EU policy? Almost certainly yes, even though the UK can be quite difficult, quite low in ambition, as we heard from Molly early on. It's still a very substantial player with a lot of evidence behind it. Is the UK lined up to do all this? Well, a long way from doing that yet, and Craig's already mentioned that. But I have to emphasize, one side product of Brexit in the UK is the transfer of extensive powers to devolved governments. That there's not really a new settlement inside the UK, so having interlocutors on the UK side is an issue, as well as being clear what the interlocutor is on the EU side. And not only that, but the UK has got rid of most of its more substantial independent environmental bodies with a sort of capacity to look forward. And so most other European countries, I should say, the German SRU is one of the very few high-level, scientifically high-octane advisory councils still running in Europe. The UK really would need to reinvent that sort of capacity, whether it's in the Office of Environment Protection, which is ideally concerned with compliance, or whether it's in some other body. So there'd be quite a lot of work to be done to make the UK into a substantial player, able to offer something. And on the other side, the EU needs to see what it has to gain in some kind of framework of what we would like to see in Europe going forward in a coherent and ambitious version of sustainability. Thanks a lot.
Great, David. Thank you very much. Well, three really useful contributions. I think just before I go to the audience, I just want to push each of you in turn, please. If there was, what do you think is the number one most important thing to focus on to try and make this work, dynamic alignment? I mean, for an organisation like Friends of the Earth, we've heard a hugely, rich, long list of issues around dynamic alignment there. But what would be the thing that perhaps would be the real thing to focus on to unlock some of the other issues being talked about? Or is that too impossible a question?
It's quite a big question. I suppose for me, I take Serpa's point about the fact that there's lots of cognate policy areas that have environmental components. I suppose thinking realistically, politically about what could be included or excluded, I would say concentrate on the environmental acquis and try and make sure that you've got a really inclusive definition in there that encompasses, for example, habitats and birds, which are excluded from the Norwegian type model potentially. So that would be my argument.
Well, beside that one, I would pick up the sustainable finance, because Great Britain is a finance centre. And actually what I would like you to do is to draw this blueprint, how this acquis would actually look like, or this what alignment elements it should have, like the trade or common agricultural policy, and then seek friends, because the Great Britain, as we know, hasn't been that bad in environmental issues or sustainable finance so far, but it might change. So I think that quite a big part of the financial community would be very supportive, and Bank of England, to this sustainable finance. I don't know, you have a very good range of free and organic farmers, or be it the consumer movements or co-ops. If you could get this kind of a sort of a alignment of people and organization and businesses to tell that, look, this is what we want. So it wouldn't be only us environmentalists doing this, but business saying, look, we need to do this for the sake of the London city and its finance to be credible. Then it might sort of fly in politics also. I don't know.
I think it is very hard to pick and choose between those, but I think the work you do on trade is very important. There's a huge loss of transparency. There's a loss of civil society engagement in the UK. There's nothing like what exists in Brussels in terms of ability to engage. It's very important that role is played there. And of course, I would say this, but making sure that we get the governance right, because if we don't do that, it's going to be very hard to unpick it later.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure there's going to be some questions and comments from the floor on this issue. Let me just see hands of people that are ready to ask any questions or make comments. Don't hold back. One or two of you look like you're thinking about it, but I want to encourage you to go from thinking to action. Let me ask the panel then. I mean, the other challenge in all of this is knowing when to, how right now, given we've got so much uncertainty about the shape of this, I mean, when do we really start engaging in the debate on this? It feels like with so much with Brexit at the moment, it's sort of very hard to sort of get your teeth into it in the current situation. And yet, once we move into it, it will have to move very fast. Any thoughts? Yeah, so.
Well, this is the hard part of it, because as long there's at least slightest hope that the Brexit wouldn't happen or there would be a referendum, it doesn't seem to be very advisable to have a great detailed papers and campaigns how this post-Brexit life should look like. But we should have at least to have some understanding, and because this is the new phenomenon in the world, we haven't seen. I'm filled with questions, and I can sort of identify issues we would need to concentrate. But I do not have a vaguest idea how to create this legally binding mechanism on the environmental, whatever that alignment would be, and what would be the dispute mechanism there, or some other issues. But someone certainly should be thinking of it and putting it in paper, because I'm pretty sure no one in the British government is doing it at the moment, nor in the EU side. And then we just might end up in the situation that then whenever, if it would happen, whatever form of the Brexit, everybody is sort of so chaotic, and there's this kind of a overwhelm of the populism and so on, that there's not the political appetite to do or prepare anything. And then we would need to have these coalitions and papers and pressure that, okay, point by point, this is what needs to happen and this is how you do it.
I think being prepared for the next stage is really important. The British NGOs in Green UK were well organised for the withdrawal bill lobby, and did win some things in the Parliament as a result of that. And I don't know when, but at some point, if the UK leaves, we're about to start this new agenda, this new dialogue, or what's the future agenda? And so we do need to kind of shape and frame that and say, well, where does environment, is this a footnote or is this a kind of central theme, and how do we do that? So I think the earlier you get in there, the earlier we have an understanding of what's the green vision of that kind of relationship, the better in a way.
I agree with David, not least because the negotiations that are going on between the Labour Party and Conservative government at the moment are precisely around these kind of questions. What will a future agreement look like? What is dynamic alignment? How can we make it realistic? How much stuff can we put into the political declaration to give Labour in particular some kind of sense of security that they're going to get the things that they want and they're not just going to be overturned by a change of Prime Minister. So I think having some kind of position now, some kind of idea now of what that environmental demand will be, or what one will be looking for, it needs to be there now, but obviously a more detailed one would come down the line if and when Brexit happens.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions in the audience now, at least, so I'll take them in threes as they emerge. Lady here.
Question more as a citizen than as an academic, and if I see Brexit, it comes from a social unrest, and environmental questions are typically seen as the questions of the elite. What is being done to link the environmental question to the people?
Very good question. I've got a whole thing on that, but I won't get into it because I'm chairing. Gentleman there.
In light of the very broad scope of the sort of non-aggression provisions in the Withdrawal Agreement, is that likely to serve as a model for the future?
Thank you. Anyone else want to squeeze in now? Yeah, Kira.
Kira Box, Friends of the Earth. I'm just interested in your views on if it comes to a toss-up between dynamic alignment and a democratic deficit in the UK, or no alignment and no deficit. Where do we go?
I feel the matrix coming on. Good. Okay. Charlotte, to you first.
The question about the environment being seen as an elitist sort of preoccupation is a really interesting one I teach on, one that I get very excited about. I think in the UK context, what's been really interesting of late has been the focus on the campaign around air pollution, where you can see very clearly that it's the poorest in society who are most at risk of being exposed to poor levels of air quality because they're more likely to have schools next to main roads or live next to main roads. So I think there are clear ways in which we can make those links, and that for me the environment is not an elitist issue for precisely that reason, and we need to ensure that for those of us who are interested in the environment, teaching about it, campaigning on it, that we get that message across, so that this isn't just something that rich people care about when they're out walking their dogs in nice bits of the countryside, that this is something that matters for everyday people. So that has come across in the air pollution debates, and those are being linked to Brexit, partly thanks to the work that Client Earth has done around taking the UK government to court. And I think there is a major fear that if and when we leave the European Union, that the UK government will take that as an opportunity to try and weaken the current rules simply because they're expensive and difficult to implement. But there is a huge popular movement against that. So, yeah, does that answer your question? I can't remember what Donald's question was. I've written down Theresa May non-regression provisions. So I'm going to skip and go to Kira's, and that and Donald can come back to me if he wants to. I don't know. Dynamic alignment and democratic deficit, no dynamic alignment, but more democracy.
But possibly bad democracy.
Possibly bad democracy. I guess I would prefer democratic alignment and democratic deficit, partly because I think the debates around the democratic deficit are a bit of a fudge. But yeah, I'll see what the others have to say and maybe come back to you on that. She dodges nicely.
Okay, if I start with this democracy and deficit, there's a lot to say. Sorry, don't hit me. About the democracy, state of the election system in the UK and democracy that matter, and a couple of other things. So there isn't that kind of a thing as absolute democracy. Plus then if you ask people stupid questions, you get stupid answers. What about organizing in all of our member states a referendum about the fact whether you will want to pay taxes or not? And then wonder after that oops, why did they say that, and how do we now pay for our schools and police and healthcare and whatever that is. So democracy is taking into account and being accountable, and that is pretty complicated, and there's much a bigger issue of democracy, and that's not only in Great Britain but all over, and that is the democratic system. And I'm a great, make no mistake about it, a great defender of democracy and great hater of the totalitarianism. But is democracy as it stands now able to solve our grand societal challenges like the climate change with this race of populism and everything? That's a lot of tough issues for us, how to make this enlightenment and alignment with the social issues too. And this is true, but are we effective communicating it? I think not. It is the poor people suffering most of the bad air quality. It is the poor farmers and workers on the fields having cancers firstly about glyphosates and hazardous chemicals and in workplaces. It is if we have a full-fledged climate change, it is the poor people in marginal areas that are suffering the most. Women in general are suffering more than wealthy men, and so on. So environment is a social issue. And if we do not solve that, we are going to be peril in social issue. These are not alternatives. It is prerequisite that we have a livable planet for poor people. But that doesn't mean that it sort of justifies having a big differences of in economic income or in taxation or whatever. But this is a debate we usually do not have adequately. Then about what was the another issue I was thinking? TTIP I wrote. Yes. What I think about the Theresa May's proposal and about this dynamic alignment as it stands for now. It is, you all guys know very well the TTIP and TTIP debate and the story. This is not going to threaten the existing standards. And boy, they are right. It's not threatening it. It's not forcing anyone to lower the standards. But that is not the point. The point is that there aren't adequate backstops for bad environmental production methods or animal treatment or whatever here or there. The point is that it prevents the further development of higher environmental standards because of this unfair competition, because of the fear of being sued in the court, even though you wouldn't be liable about having caused property right issues for some investors or whatever. And this is actually what I'm fearing very much here in the Brexit. If it goes as it is, it will sort of defreeze the development of environmental standards on the best on Britain, and it would defreeze it on the EU, because then you would be in this political tit for that. Well, we can't do it because they don't, and they can't do it because we don't, and so on. And that's why there would need to be this sort of a further development on not preserving, maintaining high levels, because we do not have high levels, as we know, of environmental standards. If we look at the sustainability of the planet, we would need to double or triple the ambition level. And how to do that and how to build that in this kind of an alignment or agreement, that's sort of, to me, the key point.
Okay, thank you, David.
On the social point, I agree with what everyone else has just said, and we haven't gone far enough to bring the social and environmental agendas together, and we haven't talked enough about things like just transition. There will be losers from the way we want to go. So I do see that as a big agenda for Europe and for the UK. In fact, this little advert here, IEP, has a paper called Think 2030, which tries to look at how some of those issues might work in Europe. On Theresa May's proposals, well, I'm not sure quite what they are yet. What we have seen is a statement, sorry to be slightly nerdy for a minute, from Greg Clark, who's the industry minister in the House of Commons, saying that there may be a similar provision which would allow British MPs to at least be informed when EU standards are changed, and it's a bit unclear whether they would either get an opportunity for a vote or would that be an automatic mechanism or what. And we have not had a confirmation of this from the Environment Minister, so it looks a little bit in limbo. I think it's worth saying that dynamic alignment for the environment is quite a big deal. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of environmental measures, and a lot of very detailed changes to them. Whereas with social measures, there are some, but there are a heck of a lot fewer of them. So even though they might both be very important, just in terms of the mechanisms, we're talking about quite different things. In terms of Kira's question, which is a good one, I think we might hear more about this in the European elections. I think there's some areas where the case for dynamic alignment is incredibly strong, and the UK having a separate policy really make a lot of sense. And even though it might be democratic, it's not going to be very effective. So I think you can say, well, in terms of coherence, in terms of employment, in terms of just not being a waste of everybody's time, dynamic alignment really does make sense. So the other areas where there are much more important scope for differentiation between the way that a measure is implemented, and a completely rigid form of dynamic alignment I can see could be quite tricky. So I think there will need to be some quite serious thought about that. Having worked a lot of my life in Brussels, I'm a bit of a top-down person, so I can see a lot of benefits in terms of dynamic alignment. But we have to remember that one of the reasons we've ended up with Brexit is a distrust of European processes and rubber stamping. So there's no point in disguising that. And it's interesting that the trade unions in the UK have been more in favour of dynamic alignment. And one of the reasons for that is, if you talk to them about it, is they say, well, we are represented through the ETUC in Brussels. We would not feel disenfranchised if we were trying to influence European policy, because we continue to do so much as we do so now. I don't know whether that's the view of the ETUC or exactly how that's going to work. But it's quite clear there's not an environmental equivalent to that. How would UK citizens participate? How would they express themselves? I mean, they can join the EB, and if Jeremy will have them, I'm not sure. Maybe you'll do your bit, but it's not exactly the same. So I think there's several layers to this.
Good. Thank you, David. Well, I'm afraid that's our time is up now. This is one part of the Brexit process that can't be extended, this particular panel. So it's very important we bring it to a close. David did make an important point there that we absolutely need to be ready for the next step in this. And I think more and more now, I find myself thinking, if there was another referendum in the UK and if there was a campaign to remain, number one of the things we'd have to be really clear about is a lot of the promises that have been made about higher environmental protections over the last couple of years in the UK, if we were to leave. Actually, nearly all of them could be made if we were members of the European Union anyway. And I think it's very important for those of us campaigning in the UK to capture those and make the case very strongly that if we were to remain, that we make sure those are in place. And indeed, to make sure that a campaign to remain this time is much more clearly about a vision for a very much more positive, green and socially just Europe, and that's the role we can play in it, so that it's a campaign for something rather than a campaign against something. So we need to put our thinking caps on a little bit about that, just in case. But for now, thank you very much to Molly Scott Cato, our keynote speaker this afternoon, and thank you also to Charlotte, to Serpa, to David for the very useful contributions they made to the panel this afternoon. I'll now hand over to the next chair, Patricia, who will be chairing the session on investor-state dispute settlement. But please give a thank you to the panel.
Okay, welcome to the second panel on investment arbitration in the future EU-UK trade relationship. So obviously we're facing a bit of the same challenge as the previous panelists, as nobody in this room and probably nobody across the EU knows what the future EU-UK trade relationship will look like. So I think we'll be rather looking at a couple of different options rather than, discussing the implications of one particular option. Let me share a couple of thoughts to kick off the panel before I'll introduce you to the panelists. So we'll probably know more by the end of this week, but in any case, the EU and the UK will continue trading, and that means we will need a form of mechanism to overview the compliance with whatever agreement we will have, and we will have to make sure, as we've just discussed in the first panel, to make sure that environmental standards are upheld and can be developed. But and that's a question I would like to discuss with this panel now. How can we make sure that civil society has an active role to play in whatever compliance mechanism will be there? So unless the UK stays within the EU, it will not be bound anymore by the European Court of Justice, and we will need other forms of adjudication in general, but in particular investment arbitration mechanisms for all trade-related matters. So the question for the panel is, what are the forms of arbitration, in particular investment arbitration? What are the options that are possible? What do you, the speakers, believe, and also you in the audience, what do you believe would be the adequate forms of arbitration to ensure environmental protection, the high health and safety standards, and an active role for civil society? Within the EU, we have the option to lodge complaints to European Commission. As civil society, we have access to the courts in member states. We have access to justice with strong limitations at European level as well, to the European Court of Justice. So what would be the mechanisms that we could use in the new trade relationship with the UK to make sure that this access is ensured? Well, if the UK intends to stay in the single market, or if it will remain part of the customs union, things of course will look quite different. In both cases, it will not have the right to negotiate its own trade agreements, as this will remain the right of the EU to do so on behalf of the customs union. But what happens if the UK's market will be completely separate from the EU market, as promoted by the hardliners of the UK? In that case, for the first time in around 40 years, the UK will adopt its independent trade policy, including trade agreements with strategic partners like the US, maybe the Asia-Pacific region first, and of course the EU. So what are the implications of these different scenarios for environmental protection standards that we've already quite discussed in the first panel? So for the second panel, what are the implications of these different scenarios for investment arbitration in particular, but also adjudication in a more general sense, and for access to justice for civil society, if that is necessary? Let's just briefly consider the scenario of hard Brexit, so the UK leaving both the single market and the custom union, and the opening of negotiations of EU-UK trade agreement. As we've heard from Molly, obviously there's the hidden agenda behind Brexit that maybe not everybody, not all citizens are aware of. So it seems to be quite ironic when Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, who has been a very fervent advocate for the Take Back Control campaign, is now ready to negotiate trade deals that include ISDS. While we all know what ISDS means, it means that companies can sue governments who seek to protect the health of the citizens, environmental standards, even try to reduce CO2 emissions, or protect biodiversity. I guess all of you have a long list of cases in front of your eyes that we all already know of. So obviously that would lead to a regulatory chill, as governments are afraid to protect their citizens simply because they're afraid of being sued. So that hardly looks like taking back control to protect UK citizens. So in any case, as Craig has already pointed out with regards to a trade deal between the UK and the US, I think also for a possible EU-UK trade deal, civil society is ready to strongly advocate against such a trade deal if it is to comprise ISDS or whatever it's called. You might be aware of a campaign that more than 200 NGOs have launched this January, together with trade unions, including also the EB and Friends of the Earth Europe, called Rights for People, Rules for Corporations, Stop ISDS, in which we promote corporate accountability regulation at EU level, in particular due diligence regulation for negative environmental and human rights impacts for companies, instead of arbitration mechanisms that put the investors' rights over public interest. So let me introduce the speakers. We have at the left, we have Helmut Scholz, who has been a member of the European Parliament since 2009, with the confederal group of the European United Left, Nordic Green Left. Helmut is his group's coordinator for the International Trade Committee and also a member of the Constitutional Affairs Committee. He's part of the delegation for relations with the US and has worked on the EP's positions on trade agreements, in particular CETA and TTIP, and is known as a critic of ISDS. We have Professor Alessandra Arcuri. She's a professor at the Erasmus School of Law in Rotterdam, specialized in international and European Union law. Her research focuses on the regime of international economic law and its relation with the protection of the environment and human rights. Together with some colleagues, Alessandra has coordinated an open letter, which has been signed by over 40 academics, addressing the chair of the UN Commission on International Trade Law on the asymmetry of ISDS. And last but not least, we have Laura Verhecke from Friends of the Earth Europe, trade and investment campaigner. She's been working on EU trade and investment policy for several years, focusing on the impact on democracy and environmental policies. And at Friends of the Earth Europe, she's also leading the work on the European petition against ISDS. She has a lot of experience working on CETA, TTIP, and JEFTA, and in particular on the CETA campaign in French-speaking Belgium and France. Okay, let me start with Helmut. What are the possible implications of these different options for the future EU-UK trade relationship? And what do you think should investor arbitration look like?
Thank you, and thank you for having invited me for this very interesting discussion the whole afternoon. And probably have to go in some details now when we are thinking about what could be a possible option in a future relationship. But summarizing a little bit the impression from the first panel, the question is, what will be the decisive political forces after a Brexit who are dealing with the future relationship? So will be a significant change in the positions of the government, being it the Tories, being it the Labour, being it the coalition, somebody joining. So what will be the political reality in the United Kingdom, who tries to find out how to shape a new trade agreement probably with the European Union. And the same is for the European Union. What do we really want to negotiate with them? Taking into consideration that there are certain probably difficult economic interests in both entities for the future relationship. We all are aware that the ISDS exists already in a very concrete form of negotiations where both are in the European Union and the United Kingdom, the Energy Charter. And in the Energy Charter, we have already today the #1 legal framework for ISDS. So the question would be, is the United Kingdom and the European Union in future again together members of this Energy Charter, dealing with the same dispute settlement mechanisms in a private way as it is incorporated in the ISDS. So we have this challenge already today, even concerning the Withdrawal Agreement. And as it was mentioned on the environmental aspect, it was not really in the focus of the negotiations. Secondly, probably the EU Commission, from their point of view, will propose a standalone bilateral trade agreement and a standalone investment agreement. You know all these discussions we had around CETA, around JEFTA, with the Singapore agreement, with the sentence of the European Court of Justice, that investment is a portfolio which belongs to the co-decision of the member states. And therefore, such a bilateral investment agreement between the EU and the United Kingdom will probably separate from any free trade agreement or association agreement to be negotiated. So we are already now facing there will be two negotiation processes about the future economic or commercial relationship between the EU and 27 and the United Kingdom. As only investment agreements need to be ratified by the EU member states. The rest could be dealt on European level. So the example of the EU-Japan JEFTA agreement, the EU-Singapore agreement as a comparison are examples in which way the trade negotiations could be developed. Totally open is who will negotiate, under which responsibility, as Commissioner Malmström will finish the leading post in the Commission for dealing with trade policies, and not as yet clear who will be the follower. What are the personal positions on that? Will be the continuation of the Trade for All strategy, where we from our group in the Parliament are saying we have to replace this Trade for All strategy by incorporating the understanding of fair and ethical trade as a basic element. And fair and ethical in this understanding does not mean only fair traded products, but fair for the environment, fair for social problems and interest of the negotiating countries and partners. So third means that the EU will have a blueprint for negotiations for such an agreement is now incorporated already in the JEFTA, the ICS system. That means the investment curve system, which is not any longer in the interpretation of the Commission, the ISDS, with a strong commitment to a multilateral investment curve. So they are going in a parallel way to have the ICS and looking for an MIC in the future. What could be negotiated then is that we need, in such an agreement, whatever it looks like, a very strong committed to obligation for investments, trade and sustainable development chapter. What is not fixed in an agreement could be interpreted, could be watered down, could be forgotten. So that means if you really want to have enforceable mechanisms in the interest of the environment, I'm concentrating on that today, it's only possible if we have an obligation within the agreement. Otherwise, we are speaking just into the air. The ICS is just a different name for the same principle, opening an extra legal path for investors, which does not exist for ordinary citizens or local enterprises. That means we are continuing the weak position we have today in free trade agreements of the European Union with third countries in the future bilateral agreement between EU 27 and the United Kingdom. This system, the ICS system, violates also the principle of equality before the law. So you ask for the recognition who is then the judge for disputes, which can always occur. That means we need a certain structure which is linked to the contents of the agreement. Because the Court of Justice, the European, is not any longer recognized by the United Kingdom, which makes it quite complicated if the worst case is coming true. The system is always a one-system way. Road, it does not provide for a catalogue of investors' obligations, and communities are negatively affected citizens cannot hold an investor responsible for what he is doing at the ground. So I think to give a final proposals that both the United Kingdom and the European Union have highly sophisticated courts and judicial systems. Judges at the courts are much more qualified to balance the interest of an investor against the interest of the society, of the public, of the villages, of the medium and smaller sized enterprises, etc., etc. They base their decisions on the EU treaties on the one side, on the constitution of an EU member state, or on the laws existing in the United Kingdom, which are much richer and more complex documents than any investment treaty. So I would say what we should concentrate on in this future struggling is that we have to try to fix in such an agreement the path towards the recognition of the national judicial systems and the domestic courts existing in all the member states. And that should be as a principle introduced in such an agreement. Personally, final remark, I fear that the majorities in the future European Parliament will not give so much hope for being successful in this direction. If not, the Brexit as such is leading all the political forces to rethink how we could shape a question and a dispute in the interest of solving for the interest of both sides. So that should maybe a tool where we are also introducing a new approach for other trade agreements the EU is concluding. So why we are only looking for a pessimistic way into the future, but maybe this relationship is giving us also the chance to rethink the whole dispute settlement mechanisms incorporated in the Trade for All strategies by Malmström. Thank you.
Thank you, Helmut. Also for reminding us that, well, there's still a lot of question marks in who on both sides will be responsible, and obviously that will make a big difference. Alessandra, you are an expert on investor arbitration. Helmut has already presented some options, some maybe worse ones and some better ones. So maybe you also want to comment on whether ICS makes any difference to ISDS, and what are your thoughts on activating or making use of a domestic legal system in trade agreements? Is that possible, and what would be the advantage of it? And what do we need to do also as civil society campaigners to make sure that environmental standards can be protected and we don't end up in a system that binds the hands of governments in fear of being sued? Helmut has already mentioned that EU-UK trade agreement would need enforceable and not, as we have now, the non-legally binding chapters on environment and sustainability. What do you think about that, and what would we need in addition? Or are there any other mechanisms that you can think of?
Right, thank you. Thanks for having organized this very interesting event first. I'll start, you expect from an academic to be very boring, but let me start to tell that I thought it was a joke when I received the invitation to talk about Brexit and ISDS, because I mean, Brexit, if it's about anything meaningful, which I'm not sure, but if it is, it's about regaining autonomy. And then, I mean, do you regain autonomy by engaging in a court, possibly the least legitimate that we have at the moment in international law? So I thought, okay, well, but of course it's very speculative. There might be talks. We have a lot of examples. But as an academic, you were asking, okay, let's think what is possible. No, I don't want to think what is possible. I want to think what is desirable. I believe in hope as a feeling of giving agency to people. So if we start to constrain our imagination, we are on the wrong foot, I think. We should aim a little bit high. So let me start to address the first question. I know I have few points, few minutes, so I'll focus on few points. I think the EULO was partly touched upon, so I might skip on that, and I will just start by saying, okay, why I think the most important issue is what I have called great asymmetry. What we have this letter signed by 65 leading academics in the field, certainly better than myself, having done much research, and it is about the asymmetric structure of ISDS, what has already been mentioned, but I think it's worth emphasizing. It's a system by which the public interest is subordinate to the one to the interest of foreign investors, and by public interest, this of course relate to issues of environmental protection. And here I link to my question. I think we should also talk of environmental justice more generally. We should speak to a broader audience. And then I will conclude by saying, okay, what could be the alternatives? So why is ISDS, and in particular its asymmetric structure, so problematic? Because what you have is that states at best in this system can act as defendants, but most dramatically, local communities have no rights whatsoever. So let me be clear, there are new treaties like CETA that are modern, that include a lot of provisions to address the critique, like right to regulate, and many other interesting reforms reference to sustainable development. But is this sufficient? Absolutely not, because the main issue about the asymmetry is not really addressed. So, and here again, I think it's good to step back, to don't think too much of the detail, but about the fact that this is an unparalleled system in international law by which a private actor can go to an international arbitration court without even exhausting domestic legal remedy.
and can enforce the awards of these arbitration tribunals relatively easy. So this has no comparison whatsoever. Now, to appreciate the degree of protection investors gain, it's always good to have an example. Probably most of you know many examples. I just take one that you may have heard of, but the Chevron versus Ecuador, where Texaco has been operating in Ecuador from 87 to 92, dumping 18 billion gallons of toxic wastewater directly into surface streams and rivers. Texaco has been then bought by Chevron. There has been an agreement in 98 between Ecuador and Texaco, but local communities were not satisfied, and most probably for good reasons. So what they do, they go to the US to try to have justice, but with no success. They go back to Ecuador for a number of reasons. Here I'm oversimplifying the case, but there is this gigantic verdict by which Chevron is condemned. On the parallel track, Chevron is suing Ecuador before one of these arbitration tribunals, lose the case, has to pay to Chevron, and the arbitration tribunal says that the judgment of the Supreme Court of Ecuador should not be enforced. Now, I don't want to enter into the merit of the case. I know it's very complex. There has been most probably some corruption, fraud, whatever. But that's one undisputable fact. The local communities are the real loser. They have no forum where to go. The environment is the absolute loser. There is an unprecedented damage around the Lago Agrio with these tons of pollution from oil extraction. So this is quite clear, illustrative of the injustice that the system fosters. At best, what you can have, because now there are all the data, but there is a lot of time that the state win. Yeah, the problem is that what is the best that can happen is that you don't have to pay, that you can keep an environmental measure, but there is nothing else you can do. And often, even when you win, there are high costs. Think of paying 1 million just for the arbitration tribunal. Recently, the cost of the Australia Philip Morris case have leaked, ranging in a shameful amount of millions for legal counsels. So these are costs that are relevant for the so-called regulatory chill. Now, if you, I'm not saying, okay, maybe you should have these rights. If you have these strong rights, is there evidence that show you need that? Because the king is naked. There is no compelling empirical evidence that show that FDIs are brought in by these treaties. There is no evidence that foreign investors are discriminated. There is no evidence, you could say, well, still they are not part of political life. Actually, there is quite some evidence in political science that multinational contribute to the political life of the country where they operate. Well, think of the recent data on lobbying in Brussels. There is not just domestic firms. Incidentally, I think that the one that was contributed more to lobbying was the chemical industry sector, with 12 million just in lobbying. And you could say also industry have aligned interest. So you were talking of glyphosate. I mean, that's so that there is no reason to have this system. Against this background, the question is, why are these actors protected so strongly and the rest of society not? Think, for instance, that of the environmental defenders regularly killed each year. In 2017, more than 200. Why don't we have a special tribunal to protect environmental defenders of which we have the empirical evidence that are systematically murdered? Let's go to Brexit. I think this system is very problematic, but let's go back there. I think if you want to have a system to solve dispute, state to state seems the most plausible. But let's push the argument. We want ISDS, there is path dependency, we already have some structures. Then my position, this is, I think we have to have rights for the local communities. And here I know that some of my progressive colleagues do not agree, to say, well, yes, let's keep ISDS and give the rights to these communities. What would that mean in practice? Means that, first of all, in these treaties, you have to include obligations for investors, and you have to do in a legal way. So a legal way would be you include one suggestion I've had in my past research, the UN Guiding Principles of Business of Human Rights, where corporations become the subject of responsibility, not just of right. This is a big step, but we have already done the big step of giving the investors rights, so we could do the rest. There are some technical issues. We can come back if you want during the Q&A, but it's absolutely something that is feasible in legal terms. And I am about to conclude. I think it's really the time to put an end to the era of pure voluntarism, in which we have all these nice words, SDGs, social responsibility, but when it comes to make these clear obligations, there seems to be a mystical taboo. Let's break this taboo, let's fight for that, because that's, if we use this system in which private actors engage with a level of international, then it should be all the actors in society. And maybe this system could bring about a positive change. So that was my contribution.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. And thanks for sharing what you said, what is desirable, and for showing another trajectory of where, I mean, the EU could go with all its trade agreement, not just with the UK, obviously, to, as you said, make investors also subject of obligations and not only of rights. So, Laura, coming to you, what are the risks, but also the opportunities that you see in your work and your campaigning in a new trade agreement with the UK, and why do we have to be very careful to make sure that we maintain a strong role for civil society in whatever compliance mechanism we will get?
Thank you for the invitation, and I'm really happy to be speaking about ISDS in the UK-EU deal, because I think it's actually one of the main risks that we could find in an investment agreement between the EU and the UK. We've talked about how the EU investment policy at the moment is very dangerous. Maybe to illustrate it a bit more, there's a UK investor at the moment that's suing Italy because Italy actually made it illegal to drill oil very close to its beaches and its shores. And there was an oil project in a protected area in Italy that was finally cancelled for environmental reasons. And now what we see is that investor is suing Italy. It actually spent $50 million. That's what they claim. They're asking for $300 million. And this is based on the Energy Charter Treaty that you referred to, Helmut. Italy has actually left the Energy Charter Treaty, but it will still be sued for the next 18 years if investors want to. So we're talking about a very dangerous system. We're talking about a very high amount of money. And I think it's important to take this into account, because it's not just about the cases that we've heard about Chevron in Ecuador, or we've heard against Italy by a UK investor. It's all the cases that we'll never hear about. You know, Chevron met with the DG Trade 4 years ago, and the vice president of Chevron told DG Trade, ISDS, they've only used it once, but what they use it for is as a deterrent. It's about all those letters, what they call, lawyers, they call it letters of intent, that will be sent to the UK government or the EU member states government about the kinds of laws that business will not like. Just to give you a story, last week I was in the UN talking about ISDS reform, right? I had a very proud lawyer next to me saying, very proud of himself, that he gets $1,000 per hour to send ISDS threats to governments. And obviously that's a lot of money for the companies when they threaten, but it's also a lot of money for the governments when they receive those threats. So he says most of the time they discuss and we settle. My clients, they get their permits back, they get the law changed. And then on the other side of the table, a former Peruvian official replied, yeah, that's exactly what happens, but we only do it over the phone so that we get no public records. And this is the power of ISDS. And ICS, I could tell you how different it is, but actually what it is not. What it is still is, it's still the same system. It's an expensive system, it's a one-way system, it's a parallel system, and it's a very costly system. We're still giving investor future lost profit. So, and it's about rights like indirect expropriation, which you don't find in national law. So it's a very, very dangerous system for the environment. And honestly, the lawyers, they know this. If you look at the law firms and how they send warnings about Brexit to their clients in the EU, but also in the UK, when they talked about the future EU-UK investment deal, they say, this is great, because the UK has signed 92 investment agreements. They're all enforced today, with including 11 member states. What, for instance, Freshfields advertise, they tell investors in the EU, you know what, you could actually sue the UK government for Brexit. And what the lawyers also tell you, like Hogg and Lovells, they say, as an investor, if you have a company in the UK, but also if you have investment in the EU, you could use the UK as a basis to sue EU member states. And I think this is really important because we also see Brexit as worse for the UK than for the EU member states, but it's not. It's what Molly was saying. It's a great opportunity for investors also to try to reduce standards in the EU itself and in member states. Because imagine what it means. There is that case of a UK investor in Romania on a gold mine. Romania in its national courts actually cancelled mining permits for this gold mine. And now that Romania is being sued, is actually thinking about reissuing them again. When this is the kind of thing that you would see if you have ICS in the EU-UK investment deal. Because then investors can threaten and can obtain a lot. And most of the time we see a lot of it happens in the oil and gas and in the mining industry. Investors are well aware that they're going to have to do something about climate change. Governments are going to ask them more and more, and they're not willing to comply. So what is the alternative? Obviously, I could tell I have the same opinion in the sense that it's time to not to give more rights to investors, but actually obligations. It's time for them to respect social and environmental legislation. I don't really think it's going to happen in the trade deal. I'll be more advocating for like a UN binding treaty or a national law in the UK and the EU on due diligence, making sure that companies comply with environmental and social legislation, but also that there's a mechanism for them when they don't comply. Civil society can actually challenge them, and you can have courts and you can have enforcement, and then you can also have awards. So that it shouldn't be about states paying when they legislate for the environment. It should be about companies paying when they don't respect environmental standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for making it so concrete what ISDS or ICS, whatever they name it, means. And thank you for sharing the Italian case, which is a very concrete example of what could be coming if we don't do the right thing. I will open up to the Q&A. We don't have a lot of time left. So who has questions to our panelists? Yes, Charlotte.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed all your presentations. I wonder then, given we were talking about non-regression, what are the implications of ISDS for the operation of a non-regression principle? Because it sounds to me as if it could just actively undermine any non-regression principle. And then how would that work legally? If you have one agreement which commits you to a principle, but then you have separate trade agreements which might allow you to undermine that principle.
I'll take one more. Yes, please. Do say who you are.
Yes.
David Owens from the Trade Justice Movement. So it seems to be agreement that ISDS is a bad thing, and ICS as well. And I know it's hard to put numbers on these things, but what are the actual chances that it's something that both the UK and EU will seek? Because I guess there's two things that count against that. One is that both sides are very aware that it's really controversial, both in the EU and in the UK among civil society and so on. Obviously, it's part of what killed TTIP. And secondly, presumably the EU will want to push for ICS, whereas the UK presumably won't want ICS. And so it's sort of hard to see how that will be squared. So what's the sort of probability of it actually being in the deal? And should it be a major focus for civil society organisations?
Okay. Who wants to start? Helmut.
Can try to start and to give the chance to you. I mean, there will be again a blueprint for that. So they will not depart from the logic of the ISDS. It's my I'm confident that it's in the logic of this commercial economic acting of big enterprises, of the economic logic in which we are. So they are by internal enterprise laws obliged to go into this direction because they are investing money and they want to be sure that the money they are using for their long-term investments, for the developing of the production, they will have something, a benefit. So they are fearing that if there is something happening, they have to pay for that, like it was in Lago Agra. I was in Ecuador. I have seen it on the ground, for example. So, I mean, this is really a problem. And therefore, I think what we are not including in an agreement, I'm persuaded, we can't judge. We can't call back, because even if you prefer a United Nations binding agreement, we know how committing the United Nations are working. That are the member states, what they are low. And if I look at the ongoing negotiations in Geneva on the UN binding agreement on human rights responsibility and environmental aspects in the economic acting of the enterprises, the EU Commission is blocking because the Commission is excusing itself that they have no mandate for doing that. So they have not mandate by the United Kingdom, coming back to the Brexit, and the other 27 EU member states. So we are just somewhere in a deadlock, and here we have to breach the logic, and I would say, yeah, we can come to a progress in the interest of the society only if we are changing the contents of the agreements. So that, for example, social and environmental aspects must be on the forefront of any trade agreement as an obligation. And that means then the investors are also obliged to fulfill it in a certain way. So if we have included in a trade agreement a reference to the Paris Protocol on climate change with all its limited obligations to reduce CO2 emissions and to how to say it in English, to lower the climate graduses to 1.5% in the next 2030, then we can ask them to do so. If we don't have it, the investors are acting in the interest of creating job places, in developing modern technologies, etc., etc. So we have to breach this logic of the economic acting, and by that, to give your question maybe a certain step forward, to create progress for the whole society. And that is, I think, also on the stake for the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU27, if it comes to this question. Otherwise, the EU28 should be obliged to act in their trading policy with third countries. If the United Kingdom is not leaving the EU, okay, then they are obliged to do the same with the third country.
All right, so the
short answers.
Yes,
because we have to wrap up.
This question of the feasibility, I also think we should believe in something that seems highly unlikely. So it's at the moment I don't know exactly. Of course, nobody knows the relation between Brexit. I mean, this is the brothers Cohen could have not done a better movie, to be honest. But so I cannot really speculate on ISDS. But let's say that this is there and may have some currency. Then I think it's there that you have to radically change the mindset. Think of trade. Trump is killing the WTO. Does that mean that now we will have all these nice other trade relations? No, at least that is a multilateral forum that has more legitimacy. It has progressed through time, and some of the appellate body ruling are extremely progressive, or, well, maybe in this environment you would not judge extremely progressive, but are quite progressive in terms of environment. So we have to be persuasive. Again, the zero draft, I'm very sorry, but it's not moving that much. And I think linking, in the beginning, it was said the boundaries are created. Also law creates this boundary, and that there is a trade regime that is just about the profit of commercial actor is a completely artificial construction that is not legitimate by any analytical theory behind. So we have to imagine different scenario, and we have to fight for them.
Oh, I get the legal question and I'm not a lawyer. So if I understand right, the non-regression would be a deal between the EU and the UK, a bilateral deal. ICS is based on international law and it usually goes above. So we see it also with environmental agreements, and it usually takes precedence over the other kinds of agreement. I think ICS is highly likely. We are convinced that it's not different from ICS. But you need to think that the European Commission is convinced that ICS is the new thing. It's very different. It's going to protect it's going to protect the public interest. And this is how they spin it, and they sell it really well. And I think for the industry and for the law firms in the UK, they might lose a little bit by going for ICS. But what they will win is in terms of coverage. So until now, you only have 11 EU member states covered by ISDS. If the EU-UK deal has ICS, then you have all the EU member states that are covered. So I think there'll be a lot of pressure from the law firms and the businesses in order to get ICS in a trade deal. And I've met with the UK delegation last week, and they really confirmed this. They say we get a lot of meetings requests from the law firms and the companies on this.
Thank you. So I'm afraid we're running out of time. So I would like to thank the three panelists, Helmut, Alessandra and Laura, for your really interesting input and for being with us. And I will invite Jagona Munic from Friends of the Earth Europe for some closing remarks.
Here, maybe here. Good afternoon or evening, I don't know what is it already. It's very hard to summarize our debate today. We had very interesting debates with some details on what is going to happen, and lots of uncertainty still, which we hoped we will maybe have less at this point in time. I would like to thank my panelists for bringing all these different aspects to the table. And maybe I would like to come back to our initial topic on environment and Brexit, and inspirational case speech of Molly Scott Cato at the beginning. So for me, the question is like what we take forward from this, you know, like as environmental activists or politician or maybe academics or any interested citizen in Europe and UK, because the Brexit issue seems so depressing. You know, like even now and after all these few hours talking about it, I see that energy in the rooms goes down. And I share that because we feel overwhelmed with uncertainty. And what is it going to mean for environmental standards and future in Europe and UK? I appreciate that there was possibility to explore like both positive and negative, not only negative aspects of Brexit. I think that's good to explore in future. We all share a sentiment that we don't want to see environmental standards going down, but we also learned today that we should not focus on environmental key and what's going to happen with that if UK leaves. And there was a lot of if UK leaves today, which is also maybe a bit hopeful, because we still hope that this is not going to happen. So what we learned that we should also look at other elements of legislation and standards related to climate change, particularly Paris Agreement and SDGs, and but also sustainable finance and trade. And on trade, we had really very good expertise how this could look like in future. And ISDS, that Friends of the Earth is another many organizations campaigning for years against that mechanism, because we think it gives too much rights to corporations and too little to citizens. I personally was a bit touched with this link, which we usually don't mention when we talk about Brexit, because we look at this technical aspect, and that's like this undermining democracy and basically this link with authoritarianism. And maybe it's, for me, it's particularly issue that I'm sensitive about, because I'm coming from Eastern Europe, from Croatia, and I see also the trend there. And what does it mean for future of both European project, but future of democracy, future of actually, in more maybe broad view, future of sustainable life on planet and Europe. So for me, that was kind of personal touch of the day. And speaking of that, how actually we should talk much more about positive solutions. So for instance, we see that this right wing is kind of riding the wave of anti-European sentiment, and that maybe complexity of European Union projects that common citizens they cannot understand, and how actually they progress on this sentiment, and also with the link of with our economic situation. So all this is quite complex, and I didn't expect this coming today in Brexit debate, but it's really indeed maybe root cause of it, and what root cause of what may happen in future. So for me, that was the warning of the today. So coming back to that solutions work, we in Friends of the Earth Europe, we debate a lot about how we move from this resistance and criticism, particularly, let's say we've done lots of work on trade, particularly criticizing TTIP, CETA, and we were very successful as a part of wider movement. And then again, we see also right wing kind of capturing some of this messaging. So we had really debate like what's the solutions to that, and we came to conclusion we have to have much more positive narrative, vision, and concrete solutions. So speaking about trade, it was mentioned earlier today by Craig that we have published this Setting Course for Sustainable Trade discussion paper, which was one of attempts to provide solutions, like ways forward in creating this sustainable, just solution that is providing, meeting the needs of all, not just the few. So in that publication, which was on the table there, maybe there are still some copies left and you can download from a website, there are 7 elements basically that we explore, and then you can look in more details. And some of them are actually mentioned today in both panels. So for instance, like how we move from ISDS and how we make actually trade agreements more equitable or under democratic control. So firstly, we would like to promote and foster the trade of sustainable goods and services rather than focus on increasing trade flow. So that sustainability elements have to be incorporated into the trade deals. And then we have to create a framework to hold corporations to account internationally, rather than giving more rights to investors and companies and their privilege. And the third is to improve standards internationally rather than facilitating the weakening by corporate lobbyists. And then we also want to strengthen the implementation of international agreements on climate change and sustainability. So we cannot have trade agreement that is above basically Paris Agreement or SDGs. You have to have some kind of level of authority of these very important international agreements. It's important that we foster local economics and that they have some measures of protection of these economies, and some economies in global south that are going to decrease consumption on long run. It's important that we support sustainable agriculture and promote regional trade. We heard today also that CAP is one of the least sustainable policies we have in Europe, so how we actually shift that towards sustainability is really important. And of course, we have to bring all of this under democratic control and actually have these trades being negotiated not behind the closed doors, but under public eye and within parliaments in all countries. So this is what these are basically elements that we want to see in the sustainable trade. And whatever happens next with Brexit, we would campaign together with our colleagues on the both sides of channel to have elements of that if Brexit happens in the new agreement between European Union and UK. So I would like to end up here on positive note. there is kind of pathway we can build together to a more sustainable future. As we heard, it's very hard because should I say force is not on our side, or maybe there is lots of power on other side. And once again, I would like to thank everybody for participating today, and I would like to thank panelists and speakers, and of course organizing organizations, Friends of the Uni, Client Earth, Friends of the Europe, the Brexit Environment Network, and European Environmental Bureau. Also, thanks for Press Club Brussels for hosting us. And I would like to share with you that there is, I think, video recording. There is going to be a report from this event, so you can have a look at that and maybe study in more detail. And don't go away, because there is reception here today for all of you until 7. So we have still some time to maybe dig deeper in some of the elements that we discussed today, and just network and see what's next for us. Thank you very much.